September 26th, 1136. England is in anarchy, and in Normandy, a battle is brewing. At the head of the army is Empress Matilda, the rightful heir to the English throne. She's about to take decisive action after being dealt a major political blow, thus laying the foundation for what would come to be known as the First Age of High Cath. But how did all this come to pass? How did High Cathism, a religion already present in the world for centuries, so greatly reshape the island we live on? I'm Dr. Annette Lynton. I used to work as an historian specialising in medieval times, and I'll be taking a trip through the history books to find the answer. Welcome to the Clash of the Cousins podcast. Ever since I completed my PhD thesis on the First Age of High Cath, on which I still give occasional lectures at Barton University, I've been fascinated by the exploits of the women who paved the way for it. Over the course of this podcast series, I'll be taking you through the stories of 6 of these women in detail. Each week, I'll be joined by a different historical expert, and together we'll take a 30-minute deep dive into the life and legacy of a specific High Cather. This week, we focus on Empress Matilda herself, or Maud, as she was known for a substantial portion of her life. There was an abundance of Matildas back then, so it makes our lives easier. Joining me is Dr. Joseph Rake, who lectures in history at the University of Clifton, and who is also a specialist in the history of the Church, particularly in pre-High Catholic times. Good afternoon, Joseph.
Hello.
So, let's get stuck right in. Tell me, the Church was, in fact, to play quite a significant part in the young Maud's life.
Well, that's almost doing it a disservice, if I dare say so, in these enlightened times. But yes, even before Maud was born, her destiny had already been shaped by the Church. You see, her grandmother, Agatha, herself a High Cather, was from Eastern Europe. Where exactly, we don't know. But what we do know is that those nations were under the rule of the Catholic Orthodoxy during her lifetime.
Could you please elaborate, Joseph, on why that was such a problem?
Well, it's fair to say that the Church didn't like the High Cather, not even a little bit. We've uncovered writings on the subject. In fact, I brought one along with me from a bishop in the 4th century. It says, the so-called Temple of High Cath does not bear being called a religion. It is a poisonous, pernicious, satanic abomination.
Oh, they really didn't mince their words.
Okay, they didn't stop at words. They sacked pagan temples, some of which were High Catholic. We know this last fact because the ancient Greek historians Zosimus and Ammianus Marcellinus each wrote about one particularly savage attack on a temple of High Cath in the later years of the Roman Empire. Marcellinus's writings, unfortunately enough, are lacunose on this point. That is, they contain gaps. But we do have a complete transcript of Zosimus's account.
These unfortunate women were uprooted from their place of worship with the gods' force, in the name of holy salvation, but against the principles of morality. Such was the destruction that no rebuilding would be possible. It was a blemish upon the world.
It was an event that shook the High Catholic community. Some even resorted to blaming Hecate herself, alleging that by denying the High Cathi her own ability to see the future, she had failed to equip them adequately. Coming back to Agatha, Maud's great-grandmother, we have no concrete information about her heritage, only speculation that she might have been Hungarian, Bulgarian, or perhaps German. What we do know is that she was married to royalty by the time she arrived in England in 1057. In fact, her husband, Edward the Exile, who had lived most of his life in Hungary, was the son of a former king of the English, no less.
And then Agatha, dutiful wife she was, followed her husband to England. But this wasn't the only reason she was eager to leave Eastern Europe behind. You see, at that time, the Orthodoxy still ruled with an iron fist there, but the Church hadn't yet become the ruling power in England, despite, of course, having a presence here all the same.
Yes, so Agatha may well have made a simple choice to flee a greater persecution. Clever. I like her already.
Yeah, she was indeed clever, but even she couldn't have predicted what would happen further down the line with her daughters.
Ah, yes, this is where we come to Margaret and Cristina. Now, you and I are both fascinated by Cristina. Indeed, we've both published on her.
Yeah, indeed, that's right. Cristina was the second daughter born to Agatha and her husband, Edward the Exile. Margaret, being the eldest child of a Cintha, would inherit the Cintha powers. And, of course, Cristina, as you well know...
A mere Bethler, but fascinating nonetheless.
Oh, indeed.
I will not be slandered nor spoken down to.
Then you shall live in sin.
As Hecate is my witness, I will live in power. Such is my right. I have no need of your execrable God.
He teaches us to submit ourselves, dear sister. His is the light, and you've chosen the shadow.
Then the shadow is where I shall forge my path.
Nevertheless, when she was older, Margaret would send her own children, Edith and Mary, to Romsey Abbey to receive tutelage from Cristina, who had taken holy orders there. Strange as that sounds, it was a deliberate plan to allow the girls to gain knowledge of their enemy.
You dare enter the house of God unveiled?
I will not be bound into servitude.
God does not bind. He nurtures, and his veil protects us from sin.
My birthright is no sin. I am a Hykatha.
Do not ever use that word in my presence. Let it never pass your lips. You are a child of God, in spite of your mother. You will retrieve your Christian veil from wherever you have discarded it, and I shall never suffer to see you without it.
Your veil now lies in the mud of Romsey, where it belongs.
I have been sent to the devil.
I am not cowed by your God, nor your devil.
So nothing would stop Edith becoming a Hykatha.
Her upbringing made her more determined than ever, as we've just heard. Once she inherited her powers, she took the name Matilda, later Matilda of Scotland, and in 1102 her daughter, that is our Matilda, was born. But she would, of course, come to be known as Maud.
And that is how we'll refer to her throughout the podcast.
Well, as you said earlier, that is a lot of Matildas, and in fact, that's barely the tip of the iceberg.
I know. Imagine me at 21, desperately trying to piece it all together in the Barton Library. I've got better since, thankfully. Maud was only 8 years old when she was betrothed to Henry V, King of the Romans, 16 years her senior in a purely political marriage intended to strengthen diplomatic relations. You can imagine her displeasure at having to marry into the church, even at so young an age. King Henry of the Romans received a substantial dowry from King Henry of England, which he would put towards funding his campaign to become Holy Roman Emperor. Although this title makes him sound like he ruled over the church, such was not the case. That doesn't mean he didn't have close ties to it, and so Maud, having been raised with a staunch aversion to the church, now found herself at its beating heart. Now, this is a period in Maud's life that a lot of people skim over, isn't it?
And more fool them. It tells us so much about what shaped her into the woman we revere.
Because it really is where the seeds of the future age of Hykath are sown.
We have enemies in all quarters, Maud, and you more than I. 2 religions in one bed and the devil rears its ugly head. Chancellor Adalbert has produced these words frequently, and I fear what knowledge he possesses of your nature.
Adalbert would have made me a laughingstock in all of Germany. He has nothing to prove.
Our problems extend further, my dear.
Would you allow your subjects to make a mockery of your wife, and without reason or excuse?
Do not take me for a fool, Matilda. Your heritage and the acts which have been carried out to conceal it threaten our future, and so the future of England.
I am the King of England's daughter, by birth and blood.
Others in your family do not share that privilege. For their sake, Maud, you must refrain from ever exercising the powers of your mother. Do your duty as ordained by God.
I answer to no God.
You answer to me.
Dr. Rake, perhaps you could provide us with some context on this point.
Well, without repeating what we've heard, Emperor Henry had effectively discovered a lie at the heart of the English royal line of succession. Margaret and Edith were both the wives of kings, and as such, society demanded male heirs of them.
But as High Cathai, they would produce only girls as long as they had their powers, so as to ensure that those powers would be passed on to the next generation and not lost with their death to a magical object.
Exactly. So Margaret and Edith, in their turn, had to procure illegitimate sons for their husbands in order to guarantee the safety of the throne, which could never be widely known in pre-High Catholic times, of course, otherwise there would have been a major succession crisis.
However, the path of Maud's life was changed forever on November the 25th, 1120, when a ship carrying her brother William Adelin, heir to the English throne, went down at sea. William would have survived what came to be known as the White Ship disaster, had he not attempted to help the less fortunate and been knocked out of his own rescue boat. He drowned at the scene, along with his half-sister and several others. So where is Maud when all this hell is breaking loose?
She's still in Europe, ruling Italy on behalf of her husband, Emperor Henry. But when he dies in 1125, Chancellor Adalbert blackmails Maud into handing over the insignia that then empowers him to lead the electoral process for the new king of the Romans. And who should get the post but Lothair of Supplingburg, sworn enemy of Maud's husband.
Crikey. So Maud's in dire straits then.
She's a widow and childless, so she's right out. Normandy, where her father is the obvious place to go, and a very wise choice at that time. For Stephen of Blois, her cousin, he never sailed on the White Ship. He jumped off before they left port, in fact, and was now laying his own plans within the royal household.
Events move against me. I advance in years, and yet am without a son and heir.
My liege, you are remarried.
Adeliza has not provided despite our efforts. I grow desperate with every waking hour.
You need not, my liege. I will be most honoured to offer my services.
I am left with no option but to summon Empress Matilda.
Cousin Maud is in France, my liege, and I am here at your side with knowledge of your court and your kingdom.
I must have her counsel. Such is my decision, and so will it be.
And it would be Maud who, in January of 1127, was named heir to the throne of England by her father. Not long after, a marriage was arranged between Maud and Geoffrey, soon to be Count of Anjou in France, who was 12 years her junior. So, Dr. Rake, what do we know about Maud and Geoffrey's marriage?
Again, a difficult one. They didn't get on, which wasn't helped by the fact that Geoffrey was only 13 when they were betrothed. But, that's 12th century diplomacy for you.
It is a task to suspend our modern standards.
Quite. Actually, despite their stormy relationship and frequent separations, Maud, being older and having a husband not involved in the church, afforded her a lot more freedom.
Well, that must have been refreshing for her. Well, up until the birth of her second daughter. As I understand, this could have brought her secret out into the open.
Yes, it was a difficult birth, one that might have cost Maud's life if she weren't able to heal herself, which she did. But of course, nobody can know that.
I'm aware, well, a letter confirms it, that she argued with King Henry over where she'd be buried.
Dearest father, I know of your plans to have me buried at Rouen Cathedral within the week, and have taken quill and parchment to my bed that I might communicate to you with the utmost urgency my disapproval of this decision. Come my death, I shall be interred at Beck Abbey, and nowhere, I repeat, nowhere is suitable other than there. Should you persist in your endeavour, then you will have committed the greatest offence of disrespecting your own daughter's mortal remains, and shall never suffer to sleep another night.
Hearing it back, I must say it's very committed. It really makes you believe that Maud actually was close to death. I mean, it has to be a ruse, one they were both in on.
Considering that King Henry would have been party to his daughter's powers, it's the only workable conclusion we can reach.
Unfortunately, the pretend dispute between Maud and her father turned real in time. Around a year later, in 1135, she and Geoffrey attempted, unsuccessfully, to convince the king to hand them his Norman castles so that they might strengthen their hold there. This split the two parties apart, and Maud and Geoffrey would then side against the king in rebellion. But events continued to be unpredictable. Not long after refusing his daughter and son-in-law's request, King Henry suddenly died. Maud was now the rightful queen, but had little time to grieve. She moved straight to attacking Normandy and taking those castles she had been denied, so she and Geoffrey would have their Norman stronghold after all. Back in England, Stephen of Blois had arrived and was building up support, and Maud's close ally and half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, could not hold him back. Aided by his brother, an archbishop, Stephen was able to use his guile to sidestep the oath that he and several others had sworn to honour Maud as the heir. By late December of 1135, he had the support he needed and was crowned King of England. So this is a big moment, and one which would doubtless have pleased the church.
They were actively involved, and of course, with Stephen's enthronement, they became the ruling faith in England, holding all the power. Naturally, the High Cathai were incensed and slowly began to organise themselves.
Particularly now that they knew Maud was one of them, which the church didn't yet.
To their minds, it was nothing more than an attack on them and their way of life.
As for why that new knowledge was useful, well, that's for the rest of the series. Maud, by this time pregnant with her third daughter, took extreme exception to Stephen's coronation and made immediate plans to march on the English throne and reclaim it, causing concern on Geoffrey's part. Gloucester, still in England, was well aware of Maud's nature, and the two men exchanged correspondence on the matter.
Dear Geoffrey, I write to inform you that I am gravely concerned for my sister, a concern I suspect you share. She will not have taken kindly to the king's enthronement, and will, in haste, seek to take up arms against him, which, with her abilities, will culminate in a battle more infernal than anything ever imagined by any man on earth. I plead with you not to let this happen, much as you may sympathize with her. The king must be removed, yes, sir, but with time and skill, not fire and blood. Yours, with best wishes, Robert of Gloucester.
So this feels like the beginning of the end for Stephen, which of course it is, but that's still a few years away at this point.
Oh, we're still in 1136 here, and despite all we've heard, Maud and Geoffrey stayed in Anjou, perhaps because they were still firming up their territories in Normandy, and of course it made more sense to put out those fires first.
Plus, Maud was pregnant.
That's why Geoffrey attempted a solo invasion of Normandy in February of 1136, which ended in a very shaky truce.
Which obviously didn't last.
No, and once Maud had given birth in the summer and was back to full strength, she pushed Geoffrey to invade again, this time with her leading.
Which brings us back to the September invasion, during which Maud, as expected, did everything she could with her Cintha powers. One contemporary account attests to an unnatural fire, which consumed the grain like an animal setting about its prey. There are also accounts of the stone of buildings liquefying before the eyes of astonished soldiers. Mentions of the devil's lightning are widespread, and the chroniclers wrote that Maud persevered through the storm, her determination much more powerful than the forces which beset her. My goodness. Just imagine if Maud had been in Iridia.
Oh, yeah, the war would have been over in seconds.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Rake, I believe you have one final thing to share with us.
Yes, I'm quite excited about this. It's a proclamation that was found written on vellum in the archive of the Castle of Argentan. It's what has become known in historical circles as the Edict of Maud, in which she declares in no uncertain terms her opposition to King Stephen.
Know this, foul cousin of Blois, unworthy usurper of the crown of England. By my father's will, the crown belongs on my head, and none shall see me parted from it without incurring the wrath of Hecate herself. You sit on the throne in London town without authority, without right, and you sit as a man who swore to recognise me as his queen. You have sullied the laws and foundations of England and turned your nose up at the Temple of Highcath in grave error, sir, in grave error. I cannot and will not allow this to pass. The age of Highcath is come, and you and your accomplices shall know me sovereign restored, and you shall bow your head in shame.
And that's where we have to end this first episode of Clash of the Cousins. My thanks to my guest, Dr. Joseph Rake, for sharing his invaluable expertise.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure, Joseph. Looking forward to receiving you the next time. And if you enjoyed this podcast, tune in next time when we'll be taking up the story of one of Maud's protégées, Alice Amor, Duchess of West Mercia. In the meantime, have a good week.